What you're about to hear isn't fiction. A general. A funeral. A drawn weapon in the middle of sacred ground. What happened next exposed a truth America can no longer ignore. This is more than a confrontation, it's a reckoning. If you think these conspiracies need to be brought into the light, hit like, comment 1, and subscribe. The next chapter in the fight for justice is just beginning. The morning sky over Halston National Cemetery hung low, veiled in a gentle gray that matched the solemn hearts gathered below. It was the kind of stillness that commanded silence, where every breath felt like a quiet prayer, and every step echoed with Reeve Ezra C. Rows upon rows of white marble headstones stretched across the hills, bearing the names of those who had given everything for their country. Amid this sacred ground stood a figure of quiet power. Major General Miravas, her uniform gleaming with medals, her bearing resolute, stepped up to the podium. The wind tugged softly at the edges of her coat, but nothing in her posture wavered. She had stood on the front lines of war, she had led battalions through fire and chaos. But today she was simply a friend saying goodbye. Before her rested the flag-draped casket of Colonel Dax Rourke, a man she had fought beside, laughed with, cried with. Her voice, low and steady, began to tell his story, not just of battles won, but of quiet courage, of loyalty, of brotherhood. The audience of grieving families and fellow service members stood in silent unity, some clutching tissues, others standing ramrod straight, unwilling to let emotion betray the pain in their hearts. Then, without warning, peace was pierced. From the far edge of the crowd, a man pushed forward, his black T-Israelite coat stark against the sea of dress blues and mourning black. His face was a twisted portrait of disdain. Officer Noxmer Ezra, a local cop with 15 years on the force and a sealed record of racial bias allegations, moved with a purpose no one invited. The hush of mourning twisted into murmurs of confusion as he shoved past uniformed soldiers and civilians alike. All eyes turned. Some thought he was part of the honor detail arriving late, but then they saw his stance, his scowl, the storm in his eyes. It wasn't grief he carried, it was something else. Something darker. Something dangerous. And in that moment, standing beneath the flag at half-mast, General Voss's voice faltered, not from fear, but from the instinct every soldier develops in combat, the sudden, electric knowing that danger is here. She looked up. The funeral had just become something else entirely. Amid the solemn silence of a military funeral, with hundreds of mourners bowing their heads in respect, the unthinkable happened. The officer in the black T-Israelite coat, who had shoved his way through the crowd like a shadow creeping into the light, suddenly drew his gun and pointed it directly at the general's chest. The air froze. Veterans instinctively reached for weapons they no longer carried. Child Ezra clung to their mothers. Soldiers gripped ceremonial rifles that had never been meant for use. And in the center of that storm, the woman under threat did not back down. She did not scream. She did not plead. She stood spine straight, eyes unwavering, staring down the barrel of a gun, as if it were nothing more than a test she had faced before. That moment didn't just fracture the peace at Halston National Cemetery, it cracked open the conscience of a nation. It exposed an uncomfortable truth, that sometimes danger doesn't come from a foreign enemy, but from those sworn to serve and protect. This wasn't an accident. It was the product of years of silence, cover-ups, and looking the other way. And in the aftermath, one question rang louder than any gunshot. When someone with a badge can pull a weapon at a soldier's funeral, who is truly being protected and who is being targeted? If you're watching this and your heart tightened like ours did that day, if you believe powerful people should never get away with this, comment 1. If you think this is just politics, comment 2. The general's voice carried clearly across the cemetery grounds, a steady Kur Ezra TF Kui Ezra Geeth woven into every word. She wasn't just delivering a eulogy, she was honoring a fallen comrade with the weight of shared battles, of loyalty forged in fire, of a bond only soldiers could truly understand. At 57, streaks of silver ran through her hair like silent marks of time. The medals on her chest didn't scream for attention, they whispered of decades spent earning every ounce of respect. She had led through chaos, survived war zones, and risen to become one of the highest-ranking black women in military history. She didn't need to announce who she was. Her presence said everything. And that perhaps was exactly what made her a target. From within the crowd, a grating voice sliced through the silence. "You don't belong here." He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The words landed like a slap, ripping through the sanctity of the moment. Veterans turned toward the man in the black coat. Their faces stiffened. They'd seen that look before, on battlefields, in hostile territories. The expression on his face wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was rage. Deep-seated, bitter rage harbored and hidden beneath a uniform, now bubbling to the surface in a place meant for Reeve Ezra Say. His eyes burned with the kind of hate that had nothing to do with protocol or procedure. It was personal. But she didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She didn't step down. She stood firm, calm, composed, as if the hostility aimed at her couldn't touch her. And in a way, it couldn't. Because her silence was louder than any outburst. Her stillness more defiant than 1,000 words. It was a stance born not of pride, but of principle. She had faced down enemy fire. And now she would face this not as a victim, but as a symbol. A silent message echoed in her every breath. I was here before you. And I will remain long after you're gone. The silence shattered. Gasps swept through the cemetery like a shockwave. Mothers instinctively pulled their child Ezra close. Uniformed veterans tensed, their hands twitching toward the holsters they no longer wore. Eyes widened. Mouths dropped open. And at the center of it all, a pistol, cold, black, deliberate, was now aimed squarely at the general's chest. The man holding it stood rigid, consumed by something far more dangerous than fear, intent. General Mira Voss didn't move. She had once faced mortar fire in Baghdad, led nighttime raids through Afghan mountain passes, and stood between chaos and her soldiers more times than she could count. What was one more barrel aimed her way? Especially on home soil in a place meant for peace. Her voice didn't crack, it didn't waver. It rang through the stunned silence, sharp and commanding. Sergeant, lower your weapon. It wasn't a request, it was a battlefield order. But the man's grip tightened. Beads of sweat broke across his brow despite the crisp morning air. His knuckles turned white against the pistol's frame. The air between them thickened, electrified by a threat that didn't belong in this sacred place. Beside her, Colonel Ezra Khan stepped forward, his voice low but urgent. Think about what you're doing. You're doing. His hand hovered just inches from his belt, not out of fear, but readiness. This is a funeral. Stand down. But the man didn't blink. Didn't speak. He just stared at the woman before him like she was the embodiment of everything he resented. Time stretched impossibly thin, seconds that felt like lifetimes. Around them, the wind stirred the flags. Somewhere in the distance, a lone bugle remained silent, unsure if it would ever get the chance to play. And yet, through it all, she remained unshaken, steady, resolute. Because even with a gun to her chest, she still held the higher ground. From the edge of the honor formation, Captain Kellen Dre, decorated Marine, combat tested through 3 brutal special operations tours, saw what others might have missed. A tremor, subtle but real. The man's hand wrapped around the pistol had begun to shake. And in that moment, Kellen knew exactly what was about to happen. He didn't wait. Years of instinct honed in the crucible of war kicked in. In one fluid, silent move, Kellen lunged forward, cutting through the paralyzed air between them. His hands locked around the officer's wrist just as the gun fired. The blast ripped through the still morning like a thunderclap. Birds scattered in a panic burst. The sound reverberated off the marble headstones, crashing into hearts that had gathered only for peace. But the bullet hit no one. Chaos erupted in a controlled surge. 4 military officers broke formation, moving with synchronized precision born from years of discipline. In seconds, they had the gunman on the ground, arms pinned, weapon disarmed, rage still seething from his throat. She doesn't belong here, he screamed. This is ours. His face contorted in fury, spit flying as he thrashed against the restraints. But no one flinched. No one answered. The silence around him wasn't fear, it was rejection. A collective, unspoken declaration: not here, not today. And through it all, the general did not retreat. She did not collapse, did not even turn away from the place she had been standing when the gun went off. Instead, she walked calmly back to the podium. A place that had merely become an altar of tragedy was reclaimed in a single step. She cleared her throat. And then, as if nothing had shaken her, she continued the eulogy. But this time, her words carried a diff Ezra T weight, not just of memory, but of resistance. Not just of grief, but of honor sharpened in the face of hate. The ceremony had been disrupted, but her purpose remained. and she would finish what she came to do. What happened that day was just the beginning. In the days that followed, an investigation peeled back layers that had long been hidden from public view. Behind the polished badge and the uniform, the truth about the officer now in custody began to emerge, and it was damning. His personnel file, once shielded by red tape and silence, revealed a staggering 27 complaints of excessive force, nearly all filed by people of color. The pattern was unmistakable. The cover-ups even more so. Internal affairs reports that had been quietly closed. Body cam footage that had mysteriously gone missing. Witnesses whose statements were dismissed or discredited without explanation. The deeper investigators dug, the more they found a system designed not to expose misconduct but to bury it. When the trial began, it didn't take long for the case to draw national attention. Each morning, the courthouse overflowed with observers, uniformed military personnel, civil rights advocates, off-duty officers, grieving citizens. They came not just for justice but for proof that the system could still recognize right from wrong. Captain Kellandre's testimony was the turning point. He stood before the jury, not in uniform, but with the quiet authority of someone who had seen the face of war and recognized it again that day. This wasn't fear, he said, his voice steady but sharp. This was hate. He came to that funeral not out of confusion or panic. He came to hurt someone because of who she was. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just a crime, it was a symptom. A warning flare from deep within the machinery of power. And now it was all out in the open. The jury didn't have to imagine what had happened. They saw it frame by frame. Surveillance footage from Halston played on courtroom screens in chilling silence. It showed the officer's deliberate approach through the crowd, his hand already on his weapon. It showed the moment he raised it, the chaos that erupted, the panic in the faces of mourners who had come only to grieve. But that wasn't the most damning piece of evidence. That came later in his own words. A recording from his interrogation was played for the court, and with it the last shreds of doubt vanished. People like her, they're changing everything. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was low, dripping with contempt. And he said it knowing he was being recorded. Not by accident. Not in heat or panic, but with the clarity of someone who believed his hatred was justified. The courtroom held its breath. The prosecution didn't have to dramatize. They didn't need to raise their voices. They simply walked the jury through the evidence, the history of complaints, the internal cover-ups, the patterns of targeting. Every defense stress, confusion, fear was stripped away under cross-examination. Former colleagues took the stand, some hesitant, some ashamed. One by one, they admitted what they'd heard over the years. The slurs, the jokes, the comments whispered under breath. They had dismissed them, ignored them. Some even laughed along. None of them had reported it. 8. And now, seated in a federal courtroom, they watched those words come back like ghosts refusing to be buried. What had started as a moment of shock was now something far more profound. The undeniable revelation of a truth America had long tried to look away from. It took just 3 hours. After days of testimony, dozens of witnesses, and undeniable evidence, the jury returned to the courtroom with their decision. The foreperson stood voice steady and read the verdict. Guilty. On all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault, terroristic threats, and hate crime enhancements. A hush swept over the room. No gasps. No outrage. Just a stillness that comes when truth is finally named, out loud, with no room left for denial. At the bench, Judge Dorian Vane adjusted his glasses, glanced over the courtroom, then locked eyes with the defendant. His voice, calm but unwavering, carried the weight of justice forged over decades on the bench. You wore a uniform meant to protect, he began. Instead, you used it to weaponize hate. You aimed a gun at someone who has given their entire life to defending the rights and freedoms of others. Today, justice removes the armor you hid behind. And then came the sentence delivered without hesitation. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom did not erupt. It didn't need to. The ruling didn't just fall on one man. It landed across an entire nation, reverberating through precincts and departments, training rooms, and academy halls. There was no mistaking it. The system had sent a message. No badge is above the law. No title grants immunity from hate. And no silence will ever again be strong enough to hide what must be faced. This was no longer just a verdict. It was a reckoning. Geez. The verdict didn't mark the end, it marked the beginning of a reckoning. Across the country, police departments began to look inward. Internal affairs divisions reopened files long thought buried. Disciplinary systems once used to shield the worst among them were now under full review. The unspoken code of silence, the protect our own mentality, began to fracture under the weight of public scrutiny and moral accountability. For the first time in years, real change no longer felt impossible. It felt overdue. Back at Fort Knox, where future officers are shaped, the woman at the center of it all stood before a new class of cadets. Her voice was calm, but there was steel behind every word. Power, she said, is not measured by what you carry on your hip or wear on your chest. It's measured by who you choose to serve. Her words didn't just echo in that auditorium, they found their way into training manuals, academy lectures, and departmental reforms nationwide. No longer just a figure in a uniform, she had become a living doctrine of ethical leadership. At Halston, near the spot where it all unfolded, a simple plaque was placed into the ground. It reads, "Courage knows no rank." And every day, visitors walk past it not knowing the full story, perhaps but feeling the shift in the air. A reminder that justice, once awakened, leaves behind more than punishment. It leaves behind a legacy. A month had passed since the shot that never landed echoed across Halston. Yet for many, the real impact was still unfolding. The headlines had faded, the courtroom was quiet, and the public outrage had moved on to the next story. But in precincts across the nation, conversations were still happening in roll call rooms, in academy classrooms, in the quiet moments when the badge felt heavier than usual. The name of the woman who stood tall at that funeral had become more than a headline. She had become a benchmark. Her silence in the face of hate had spoken louder than any weapon ever could. Her calm had rewritten the definition of St. Ezra Geith. At Fort Knox, a cadet stood at the same podium where she once spoke, reciting her words as part of a new training tradition. Power is measured by what you serve. They we Ezra T just repeating them. They were starting to believe them. In a small town miles away, a mother explained to her daughter why a plaque at Halston had changed how people looked at courage. In another city, a young officer quietly resigned from a department that refused to change and began working on a campaign to become sheriff. And in the stillness of her own home, the woman at the center of it all sat alone with the photo of her friend. The flag still folded. The medal still framed. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need revenge. What she had earned, what she had fought for, was something deeper. A future where people like her no longer had to stand alone. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a roar. Sometimes it begins with a quiet act of defiance and keeps growing long after the cameras leave. This story isn't just one to make us angry, it's one to make us think. To think about how a person can be targeted not because of anything they did, but simply because of who they are, where they stand, or what they represent. We learn that silence in the face of bigotry is complicity, and that apathy in the face of abuse is how freedom slowly fades. But what makes this story powerful is not just what happened, but how it ended. A woman returning to the podium, finishing a eulogy with dignity, as if a gun hadn't just been pointed at her. That is courage. That is grace. And that is a reminder that sometimes the quietest response carries the most lasting power. I'd like to invite you, yes, you watching, to share your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed a moment where prejudice silenced truth? Have you ever stayed quiet in the face of injustice and wished you hadn't? What do you believe needs to change so no place of honor ever again becomes a stage for hate? As for me, this is more than a story, it's a wake-up call. I believe if we keep hiding the truth because it's uncomfortable, then we allow it to grow stronger in the shadows. But if we choose to see it, speak it, and confront it even in small ways, then we carry forward the courage of the one who stood tall that day between a gun and a silence that was far too familiar. Note, this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising a Ezra S. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.